I wasn't searching for Tartaria when I stumbled upon the camps. My research focused on American utopian communities, those peculiar social experiments that appeared throughout the countryside from 1840 to 1920. Brook Farm, Oneida, New Harmony, the Shakers, the Harmonists, the Fourierists. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, settlements that emerged seemingly out of nowhere, drew in hundreds or thousands of followers, functioned under strange social agreements, and then vanished without a trace. Most of them simply disappeared. The standard historical account is simple enough. European socialist philosophy inspired idealistic reformers who tried building perfect societies but failed. They collapsed due to economic strain, internal conflicts, leadership failures, the typical reasons given. Matter settled. Yet the more deeply I investigated, the stranger things became. It's not that these communities existed, that part's thoroughly documented, but rather the timing, the organization, and the particular things they seemed determined to conceal. That's precisely where Tartaria becomes unavoidable. Let me share what I discovered. From 1840 to 1900, more than 130 documented utopian communities were founded across North America, but what initially caught my attention was the clustering pattern. These settlements didn't emerge randomly over time, but appeared in concentrated waves, distinct bursts of activity. Between 1840 and 1850, 27 communities were established. Then, from 1890 to 1900, 34 more appeared, and their locations weren't random or widely dispersed either. They concentrated in particular areas: upstate New York, the Ohio River Valley, Southern California, precisely the same regions where Tartarian architectural anomalies appear most frequently. Just coincidence? Perhaps, but then I began mapping them out, physically plotting their locations against documented examples of massive, elaborate 19th century architecture, the kind conspiracy theorists link to Tartaria, buildings with no recorded construction history, structures that materialized in undeveloped frontier settlements, fully formed with craftsmanship, supposedly requiring industrial infrastructure that hadn't yet arrived there. The correlation was disturbing. Within 50 miles of almost every significant utopian community, you'll discover at least one unexplained building, sometimes multiple structures, grand hotels in villages of 300 residents, enormous exhibition halls in freshly settled territories, courthouses with Baroque details demanding master craftsmen who vanished without leaving any other evidence of their presence. This pattern repeats itself with disturbing consistency. Here's where the conventional explanation breaks down completely. These communities weren't isolated experiments operating independently, but were organized, coordinated, connected through networks that logically shouldn't have existed. Let me clarify. In 1843, a man named Aidan Ballou established the Hopedale community in Massachusetts, and that same exact year, John Humphrey Noyes founded the Putney community in Vermont. Within mere months, the Wisconsin Phalanx formed in Ceresco, and the Sylvania Association launched in Pennsylvania. 4 distinct communities, different founders, different stated beliefs, all initiated within months of one another. The official narrative claims independent actors, inspired by the same cultural movement, coincidentally taking action simultaneously, but examine it more closely. They shared members, and documentation reveals individuals moving between communities with suspicious regularity, not abandoning one to join another, which would make logical sense, but maintaining simultaneous membership in multiple communities, traveling in circuits as though conducting inspections or filing reports. And here's the most peculiar aspect. They shared architectural blueprints. The structures themselves, the communal gathering spaces, the residential buildings, the work facilities display remarkable uniformity across supposedly independent communities, separated by hundreds of miles. Identical proportions, matching decorative features, sometimes the exact same floor layouts. In 1850, communication across such distances was slow, costly, and challenging. Yet somehow these supposedly isolated experiments were constructing identical buildings, drawing from the same recruitment pools, and coordinating their launches within impossibly tight timeframes. This prompts a straightforward but crucial question. Who orchestrated all of this? Now let me tell you about the refugees. Every major utopian community welcomed what they termed refugees, people without clear backstories, individuals or entire families who showed up claiming they were escaping religious persecution, economic difficulty, or vague problems from back east. But the records are peculiar. Consider the Amana colonies in Iowa, founded in 1855, which accepted 1,200 members during their first 10 years. Official documentation lists names but not origins, not former addresses, not family lineages extending beyond a single generation. Why the omission? These communities maintained incredibly detailed records for everything else. They documented every bushel of wheat harvested, every yard of fabric woven, every dollar earned and spent. But inquire about where someone lived before joining and the records fall silent. The further I dug, the more consistently I encountered this pattern. Communities that tracked absolutely everything except the prior lives of their members. Not accidental gaps, but intentional ones. The Oneida community in New York kept exhaustive genealogical documentation, but only after people became members. Before that point, nothing exists, as though their members materialized from thin air with no history worth preserving. Once you recognize this pattern, it's impossible to ignore. These weren't settlements of idealists fleeing conventional society, but communities engineered to conceal people, to eliminate their former identities, to provide them with fresh narratives. But who exactly were they hiding? And from whom? Here's where we must address the obvious issue. Tartaria, or whatever label we assign to that architectural and cultural enigma, supposedly disappeared around 1800 to 1850, depending on which chronology you accept. A civilization erased, its structures relabeled, its history completely rewritten. But if Tartaria actually existed and was destroyed or assimilated around the mid-19th century, what became of the people who remembered it? Not the aristocracy or ruling class, but ordinary citizens who inhabited those cities, who constructed those buildings, who possessed the expertise behind those construction methods. You can't eliminate a civilization without leaving witnesses unless you hide them somewhere. The timing is too perfect to dismiss. The initial wave of utopian communities from 1840 to 1850 aligns precisely with the alleged final elimination of Tartarian presence throughout North America, as though someone urgently needed locations to relocate people quickly and in large numbers, not merely to hide them, but to silence them. Let me present something concrete. The Shaker communities, arguably the most renowned of these utopian ventures, constructed buildings that continue puzzling architectural historians. Clean designs, flawless proportions, building methods that produce structures still standing solid today, 200 years later, requiring minimal major repairs. The conventional explanation credits divine inspiration combined with meticulous craftsmanship, but the Shakers recruited from ordinary society, farmers, tradespeople, regular folks, not master architects or trained engineers. Yet their buildings demonstrate understanding of structural principles that weren't formally taught in American architectural education until decades afterward. Load distribution systems, thermal efficiency techniques, acoustic engineering. They built round barns, complex structures demanding precise mathematical calculations, before such designs appeared in any American pattern books. How did they manage this? The typical answer suggests trial and error, traditional folk knowledge, fortunate intuition. But here's what bothers me deeply. They constructed these sophisticated buildings immediately, showing no progression from basic to complex designs, no apparent learning period. The earliest Shaker barn is equally as sophisticated as their final ones, as if they already possessed the knowledge, as if they'd done this work previously. The evidence points towards something far more significant than religious inspiration alone. Then there's the linguistic puzzle. Multiple utopian communities created their own languages or dialects. The Harmony Society, the Zohar separatists, even certain Shaker communities employed unusual terminology. The standard explanation attributes this to religious differentiation, developing sacred vocabulary, establishing group identity. But I uncovered records, rare fragmentary ones, from investigators and journalists who visited these communities during the 1860s and 1870s. Their reports mention overhearing elderly members conversing among themselves in languages they couldn't recognize. Not German, not any Native American language, not any familiar European tongue. One account from 1872 by a journalist visiting the Amana colonies describes hearing two elderly women speaking in a flowing, melodic tongue, unlike any I have encountered throughout my travels spanning 4 continents. When questioned, they insisted it was Old German, but the journalist knew German fluently and observed it bore absolutely no resemblance. The conversation ceased abruptly. The women went silent, and the journalist was courteously asked to depart. This pattern repeats itself consistently. Strange languages quickly suppressed when outsiders draw near, elderly members who were the final speakers dying without passing the knowledge forward, information evaporating, not accidentally lost, but deliberately withheld. And here's where things become genuinely bizarre. These communities didn't gradually fade away, but ended abruptly. Between 1890 and 1920, over 90% of utopian communities dissolved, not slowly through decades of declining membership, but shut down within years, sometimes just months. The official explanations vary. Economic hardship, deaths of leaders, waning commitment to communal principles, but examine the specifics closely. The Harmony Society, economically thriving and extraordinarily wealthy with profitable industries and thousands of acres, dissolved in 1905, simply ended operations, divided their holdings, and disbanded. What prompted this? The Zohar separatists, established in 1817, survived the Civil War, economic depressions, multiple leadership changes. Then, in 1898, they voted to dissolve, ending 80 years of communal existence by simple vote. No crisis triggered it, no catastrophe, merely a decision, and the strangest element is the silence that followed afterward. You can locate abundant documentation covering these communities' foundings, their operations, their everyday activities, but regarding their endings, minimal records exist, few interviews with former members, virtually no first-hand testimonies explaining why they disbanded. The participants fell silent, returned to mainstream American society, and never mentioned it again. Let me provide specifics about what disappeared. The Oneida community manufactured animal traps and silverware using metallurgical methods that baffled their competitors. Their steel maintained a sharper edge longer, Their silver resisted tarnishing better. Their manufacturing produced less waste material. When the community dissolved in 1880 and transitioned to a joint stock corporation, the products continued production, but the techniques became simpler, quality declined, and the mysterious efficiency vanished, as though the individuals who understood the superior methods either left or ceased sharing their knowledge. The identical pattern emerges in the shaker furniture tradition. Early shaker pieces created while the founding generation still lived demonstrate joinery techniques that contemporary craftspeople struggle to reproduce. Joints requiring no glue or nails, yet remaining solid for 2 centuries. Later pieces made after the original craftspeople passed away, though still well constructed, were noticeably simpler. The advanced expertise gone. The Amana woolen mills manufactured cloth exceeding anything else produced in America during the 1860s through 1880s, achieving thread counts that shouldn't have been possible given their equipment, dyes that never faded, waterproofing achieved without chemical treatments. When Amana transitioned to a corporate structure in 1932, textile quality immediately dropped. The veteran workers retired or died, and the knowledge disappeared, not gradually eroding, but suddenly absent. Now let me reveal the impossible element. Between 1890 and 1905, during that wave of sudden dissolutions, something peculiar occurred. Multiple communities separated by hundreds or thousands of miles with no documented communication between them ended within months of each other. In 1898, Zoar separatists dissolved. 1899 brought the altruist communities disbanding. 1900 saw the Ruskin Cooperative close. 1902 ended the Helicon Home Colony, and 1905 witnessed the Harmony Society's dissolution. 5 communities across 5 different states, all terminating within 7 years. Why this synchronization? The official explanation calls it coincidence. The general decline of communitarian enthusiasm, economic modernization rendering such communities obsolete. But here's what troubles me profoundly. They weren't failing operations. The Harmony Society possessed enormous wealth. Zoar remained stable. These weren't struggling experiments limping toward inevitable collapse, but thriving operations that abruptly ceased functioning, as though they'd accomplished their purpose, completed their assignment, as if the witnesses they'd been sheltering had finally passed away. And what remains today? At former utopian community sites throughout America, you discover the strangest architectural survivors, not the communal housing which often disappeared, not the workshops or agricultural buildings, but the ceremonial structures, the assembly halls, the religious buildings. Structures demonstrating construction expertise exceeding what these communities should logically have possessed. Buildings with acoustic characteristics allowing whispers to travel across impossible distances, with thermal control defying available technology, with symbolic decorations matching no recognized tradition. The Shaker Meeting House in Canterbury, New Hampshire, features perfect acoustics achieved without modern sound engineering, built by farmers possessing no architectural training. The Harmony Society's church in Economy, Pennsylvania, incorporates astronomical alignments built into its foundation, precise to degrees requiring surveying instruments the community didn't own. The Amana community's meeting houses display timber framing employing techniques absent from any American carpentry manual published before 1900. They're still standing today, silent witnesses to knowledge that shouldn't have existed. The deeper my investigation went, the more I discovered these anomalies, these impossibilities. Let me tell you about how the elderly were treated. Every account of these communities from the late 19th century mentions the exceptional reverence shown toward the oldest members. While not unusual since many cultures honor elders, the specificity here is remarkable. In the Amana colonies, the oldest members were called witnesses, literally, not metaphorically, not as some religious designation, but as their official title in community documentation. Witnesses to what exactly? The Shakers granted their eldest members, particularly those over 70, special privileges including private quarters, exemption from labor, dedicated caregivers, as though preserving them was absolutely essential. And here's what's genuinely haunting. In multiple communities, explicit rules prohibited recording the life histories of the oldest members, precisely the opposite of what you'd anticipate. You'd expect they'd want to preserve their founders' memories, but instead, silence was mandatory. The Harmony Society enforced a strict rule stating no member's history before joining could be discussed, with violation resulting in expulsion. Why this prohibition? What were they protecting, or what were they preventing from being remembered? By 1920, it was finished. The communities had vanished, the witnesses were dead, the buildings endured, but the knowledge didn't. And America forgot, deliberately. I can't definitively prove that claim, but the speed and completeness of this collective forgetting is extraordinary. These communities had involved thousands of individuals, members, visitors, business partners, neighbors. Yet within a single generation, they became historical footnotes, curiosities, quaint failed social experiments. The architectural anomalies credited to folk wisdom, the linguistic mysteries never properly investigated, the coordination never questioned, the abrupt endings never adequately explained. Official history simply moved forward. And here's what keeps me awake at night. It succeeded. Ask anyone about 19th century American history, and they'll mention westward expansion, industrialization, the Civil War. But ask about utopian communities, and you receive blank stares. Perhaps someone recalls the Shakers made furniture. But the scale, the coordination, the architectural mysteries, the strange languages, the impossible techniques, all gone, erased. Not from the historical records which still exist buried in archives, but from our collective memory, as though someone deliberately wanted these questions to remain unasked. So let me pose the question directly. Were these communities concealing Tartaria's final witnesses? Were they refugee camps for people who remembered a different history, who possessed knowledge requiring suppression, who spoke languages needing to die? The official explanation of idealistic social experiments doesn't account for these patterns, doesn't explain the coordination, the architectural impossibilities, the deliberate silence regarding origins, the sudden terminations. But if these communities were designed to isolate and gradually eliminate the last individuals who remembered Tartaria, who could build like Tartaria, who spoke Tartarian languages, who knew Tartarian techniques, then suddenly everything makes perfect sense. The timing aligns right after Tartaria's supposed erasure. The locations cluster around Tartarian architectural sites. The secrecy about origins conceals people's true identities. The architectural knowledge represents remnant skills from a vanished civilization. The languages were Tartarian tongues dying with their final speakers. The sudden endings marked missions completed and witnesses gone. But there's an alternative interpretation that doesn't make complete sense either. Perhaps these communities were attempting to rebuild Tartaria, not hide it, but resurrect it. Secret societies working to preserve and transmit forbidden knowledge, using religious communes as cover to practice ancient techniques, teach lost skills, keep the flame burning. But they failed, were stopped, or chose dissolution rather than face discovery. Either interpretation, whether hiding witnesses or attempting restoration, the evidence strongly suggests these communities knew something we've forgotten, something we were made to forget. And that's what haunts me most deeply. Not what the evidence reveals, but what it doesn't show. The absence of transition narratives, the missing documentation of endings, the collective silence maintained by thousands of former members. When these communities dissolved, their members returned to ordinary American life as farmers, merchants, laborers. They didn't write memoirs, didn't grant interviews, didn't preserve their extraordinary experiences. Thousands of people who'd lived radical alternative lifestyles for decades simply went silent. The silence was deafening, and it was universal, spanning communities, decades, and geographic regions. Nobody talked. That defies human nature. People tell stories, particularly about transformative experiences, yet these thousands of individuals all independently chose silence, or were compelled toward it. So what knowledge died alongside them? The construction techniques producing buildings still standing strong after 2 centuries. The metallurgical processes creating superior steel. The textile methods generating fade-proof dyes. The acoustic engineering built by farmers. The languages spoken by grandmothers. All of it vanished, not lost gradually or fading across generations, but terminated, severed. And we're told this was natural, inevitable, the normal progression of historical events. But the evidence suggests something far more significant. I began searching for utopian communities and discovered witness camps. I started researching social experiments and uncovered orchestrated silence. I started tracing architectural anomalies and found deliberate amnesia. Official history claims idealists attempted building perfect societies and failed, but the evidence poses a different question. What if they were never about constructing the future, but about burying the past? What if those communities weren't utopian experiments at all, but witness protection programs, holding facilities for people who knew too much, or ark ships for a dying civilization, making one final attempt to preserve what was being systematically erased? Were they concealing Tartaria's last witnesses, or attempting to resurrect Tartaria itself? I don't possess the definitive answer. The documentation that would prove it is absent, suspiciously and conveniently missing. The people who knew are deceased, the communities dissolved, but the buildings remain, those impossible structures scattered throughout America, whispering secrets through their perfect proportions and mysterious techniques. And once you recognize the pattern, the timing, the coordination, the silence, you cannot unsee it. Perhaps we're inhabiting the world those communities were attempting to prevent, or the world they abandoned, trying to rebuild. Either way, something immense was lost, and somebody wanted it precisely that way. The question isn't whether these communities were connected to Tartaria, but rather what did they know that required such elaborate erasure, and who benefits from us not asking? Where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments which city or country you are from. We would love to know who is watching with us. Share your thoughts, observations, or questions. Every comment is important. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. Together, we are creating a community of curious explorers.